Welcome, everyone, to our series of conversations on biopolitics and democracy. In these conversations, we aim to explore the political tensions we have been experiencing since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. Our aim is to raise awareness of the biopolitical dimensions of the ways in which states and society have been dealing with the current global health crisis, as well as to understand the changes that the pandemic has brought upon our forms of life. And we would also like, through these conversations, to propose a critical exercise of political imagination about possible futures after the pandemic. Today, we are delighted to have Andre Duarte with us. Andre Duarte is professor of philosophy at the Federal University of Paraná in Brazil. He leads the Ontology, Phenomenology, and Hermeneutics research group there, while also teaching in the graduate program in education studies. Professor Duarte writes on political philosophy and ethics, drawing, among others, from Heidegger, Arendt, Foucault, Butler, Nietzsche, and Agamben. He's the author of, in Portuguese, Lives at Risk, Critique of the Present in Heidegger, Arendt, and Foucault, and of a recent book on the experience of the pandemic and democracy in Brazil, which is forthcoming in English under the title Pandemic and Crisis of Democracy with Routledge. It should be out sometime end of August, beginning of September. And we're going to talk more for sure about this book today. Welcome, André. Thanks so much for being here with us.
Thank you so much, Daniele. Thank you so much, Federico. It's a pleasure to be here and be able to talk to you and to the audience about this forthcoming book of mine. I'm very happy. This is the first time I'll be talking about the book. So let's see what happens. I'm very happy. Thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Great. So let's get started with the first kind of general question. You have been working on biopolitics and necropolitics for quite a long time now. Do you think that these concepts of biopolitics and or necropolitics help us understand the COVID-19 pandemic and the ways in which the states have responded to it? And if that's the case, why, in your view, are they important?
Yeah, that's a very, very important, interesting question. Yes, I think that biopolitics and necropolitics, together with neoliberalism, are key notions for us to understand the COVID-19 pandemic and the way the states responded to it. Although I think it's necessary for us to consider that particularly biopolitics and neoliberalism, they present some important differences when they get to be implemented in different countries. Biopolitics and neoliberalism, they're not exactly the same, nor do they happen to be implemented in the same way and exactly with the same outcomes and side effects, whether they are implemented, say, in Brazil or elsewhere. I think that it is necessary to provide some specifications when one comes to recur to such concepts in different social, economic, cultural, and political realities, so that we can extract the better clarifying potentialities from those concepts in each case. I also consider important not to try to understand the COVID-19 pandemic and the state's responses to it by recurring to only one of those concepts, as if only one of them could provide clarification to the whole situation, which is always very complex. So I would like to go a step further from the idea that we should use biopolitics, neoliberalism, or necropolitics in terms of umbrella concepts. Much to the contrary, I think that biopolitics, neoliberalism, necropolitics, they have shown to have become intertwined in most countries, the differences being in the way they have interacted in each case, which of those concepts has become a leading concept of the most important one in each case. Particularly in Brazil, which is the focus of my forthcoming book, Pandemic and Crisis of Democracy under Bolsonaro, I consider that the necropolitical vector has been predominant. And so it has produced a kind of an intensification of the anti-democratic side effects which are proper to biopolitics and neoliberalism. So this is a whole general idea of what I'm thinking about these notions. Of course, we can specify a little bit what's the meaning of specifically biopolitics in the case of Brazil. So this is to begin with.
Hey, thank you, Andre. I think I would like to just follow up on this with precisely reflecting on the case of Brazil. So in your book, you explore, let's say, the particular distinctive aspects of this case. So could you maybe say a little bit more about how you think this notion of biopolitics apply to the Brazilian context and Bolsonaro's response to the pandemic in particular? Do you think there is some sort of distinctive character in this response?
Thank you so much. Also very interesting question. I think that the unique aspect that characterizes the way the Bolsonaro administration responded, so to speak, to the COVID-19 pandemic was the fact that the necropolitical governmental strategies, they have become predominant. And so they have intensified what I have called as the damaging anti-democratic effects, which are proper to biopolitics and neoliberalism. I also think that the Bolsonaro case is worth studying since it provides a clear depiction of the horrors implied by the close interaction between those three different governmentality strategies. Were that not the case, and Brazil would never arrive to a cipher of more than 600,000 deaths. So I also believe that particularly biopolitics has acquired a particular tone here in Brazil, since it had nothing to do whatsoever with the implementation of public policies to confront the pandemic at the expenses of political freedom by means of the excesses of state sovereign powers, much to the contrary. So here in Brazil, we only had a few state-driven public policies implemented by the Bolsonaro administration, and that was only due certain social pressures for the government to do so. So Bolsonaro government never wanted to implement public policies to deal properly with the pandemic. Were that not the case, and the government would have tried to pretend that nothing of much importance was happening in the country, was there not a certain social pressure for the government to implement public policies, then most probably almost nothing would have happened from the state position. Particularly in Brazil, then, biopolitics acquired its importance by means of presidential discourses that have really emphasized the differential aspects in which people suffered the effects of the pandemic. Let me try to explain that. What effectively mattered to the Bolsonaro administration was to politicize the virus and the reactions people had or believed the government should have to face the issue. Since the beginning of the Bolsonaro administration, they decided not to face the problem by means of scientifically based sanitary measures, since they were considered to be too expensive, unsympathetic, and damaging to the Brazilian economy. It's clear that Bolsonaro, he has always considered that the effects of the economic crisis would damage his political plan for re-election in the elections, presidential ones from October to 2022 in a couple months. At the same time, he never believed that state-driven economic policies should be put to work in order to rescue people's lives while they stayed in their homes. So we have this kind of sinister clash or encounter between Brazilian strands of biopolitics and neoliberalism And they led to the fact that no state-driven public policies were exactly organized or coordinated by the government, whose main response to the pandemics was to constantly deny it. So biopolitics then has turned into a way to produce and aggravate an internal division amidst society between those who align themselves with the opinions of the Bolsonaro administration and decided to continue to live during the pandemic as if nothing that mattered was happening, and all those who decided to confront such absurdities and were immediately labeled under derogatory designations such as communists, idlers, bandits, and most interestingly, as not being courageous self-entrepreneurs able to face the risks posed by the pandemic. And the opposite of that position, the courageous self-entrepreneurs, in the president's words, the opposite of that were exactly those ones whose lifestyles were described as being nothing but spoiled children who could never stop blubbering and crying. In fact, biopolitics in Brazil had much more to do with the production of political cleavages between those aligned with the phantasmatic neoconservative social ideal of the good citizen, readily sponsored by the Bolsonaro administration by means of their actions, omissions, and speeches, and all other whose lifestyles and adherence to scientifically based sanitary measures had their lives considered as unworthy and even as dangerous, in the sense that they supposedly posed a danger to the so-called unity and homogeneity of the Brazilian nation. So in fact, those who criticized the Bolsonaro misgovernance or misgoverning of Brazil during the pandemic, they were readily considered as enemies to the nation, and they were constantly vilified, to say the least. Finally, I think that the most distinctive feature of the Bolsonaro administration in the face of the pandemic, it has to do with the fact that he never once abandoned or changed his own nihilistic opinions on the matter. Never a step back, never a change, but always the intensification of lies and aggressive behaviors against all people who dared to confront such absurdities. Hence the necropolitical outcomes derived from such a political position. So this is very distinctive of the Bolsonaro administration, the way they handle and did not handle the pandemic issue.
Great. Well, this is also something that I think is related to what you have been talking about, because the next thing that I wanted to ask you was about kind of the experience in Brazil, but from the point of view of what can we learn from this experience in terms of, you know, kind of possibilities to resist this push towards authoritarian forms of government. And something that you said that to me also is a kind of clear feature of biopolitics in general, this creation of social and political divisions that in Brazil took a very specific form that you have just explained. What happened in Brazil? Were there movements of resistance? How can we learn from this experience? Perhaps, you know, like just talking about the Brazilian case, you know, like in terms of where do we go from here? How do we resist to these kinds of mechanisms?
Yeah, I would like to try to divide your questioning into two aspects. From what we can learn from this kind of experience, I would say that theoretically speaking, I think that a main lesson to be drawn from the Brazilian case, it has to do with the consideration that contemporary crisis of democracy, particularly those affecting the conditions of democracy today, they should not be analyzed by means of a sole concept or notion. It is time for us, I think, to understand that contemporary power apparatuses, they do not rest exclusively only on one of such concepts as biopolitics, neoliberalism, necropolitics. Sometimes we have this idea that if we stick to what those concepts, we're going to be able to explain a whole complex situation. The idea that they are different governmentality strategies, but that they can easily intertwine and produce multifarious damaging aspects to contemporary democracy. I think that this is a key notion that I have tried to propose in my book. So to overcome this idea of the umbrella concept. Another theoretical feature that I believe is important for us to deploy from here onwards and to consider, it has to do with thinking which kind of democracy derives from this merge between neoliberal, biopolitical, and necropolitical power strategies. What is left of democracy, and into what is democracy changed when we face such kind of dilemmas? In other words, I think that we should try to go a step further. It's not only necessary for us to consider that democracies can be done from within themselves without the need of a traditional coup d'etat. It is also necessary for us to ponder on the nature of democracy, what happens to democracy, to the remnants of democracy when biopolitics, neoliberalism, and necropolitics become combined, which is the case, I believe, in the whole world, but mostly in Brazil, I'm sure this is the case. It is certainly a very damaged democracy, one that I have called as facade democracy. What I have tried to conceptualize is this kind of ambiguous political regime where authoritarian features are combined together with the remains of certain democratic institutions and values, although highly depleted. It is necessary, I think, to overcome simplistic distinctions between democracy and authoritarianism, since both regimes, they can actually become combined. And this is what I think that Bolsonaro is trying to produce here in Brazil. His dream, of course, is to revoke democracy, since this is quite complex to achieve. He would be more than satisfied to implement in Brazil what I have called as facade democracy, which is a concept that combines certain features from what has been called as illiberal democracies, immunitarian democracies, populist democracies. I have chosen facade democracies because of some reasons I explain in the book, but I think that this is Bolsonaro's main political goal. If we are, and then to the second aspect of your question, if we are to resist to this horrendous situation, I believe we have to reconsider what kind of democracy we want. How do we conceive of it? In my book, I tried to argue that it is essential not to define and understand democracy exclusively under institutional features. One has also to acknowledge that the core foundation of democracy is of an ethical political nature, and it has to do with the collective and plural struggles of the demos. Otherwise, all that is left of democracy is a set of institutional practices and values, which of course are of utmost importance, but they are not enough for us to consider that we effectively live then under a strong or healthy democracy. In other words, we have to find ways to understand wherein lies the crisis that deeply affect the nature of contemporary democracies. And if we do so, I think that at the same time, we find where are the sources that really count when we consider what a democracy is or should be, that is a political regime where the ties between power and demos are related to political struggles for redistribution and for recognition. This is another aspect that I believe important to stress. We we would do better if we overcome this kind of opposition between recognition struggles and redistribution struggles. Sometimes there is this kind of, especially on leftists' understandings of democracy, there is this kind of separation or hierarchy between those two different ways of political struggles. And I believe that the idea that Butler has advanced on plural alliances between different political subjects, not defined exclusively in terms of identity issues, but not refraining from the importance of acknowledging the importance of identity issues. I think that this is a most important aspect for us to go on further and redefine what kind of democracy we would like to live in and we would like to foster.
That's very interesting. I think there are several things we could develop there, but I would like to somehow zoom out a little bit and, drawing on what you said about, the way democracies were transformed and the way also that, democracy shouldn't be defined only by its institutional features. Zooming out from the Brazilian case, how do you think that the pandemic and the responses to it have somehow transformed or affected democracy, democratic participation, democratic rights, for example?
Yeah, it's very difficult to offer a comprehensive answer to this question because in the world different realities are there, and so it's complicated. But I think that a most important aspect here. It has to do with the fact that huge public manifestations, they have become almost impossible to happen, at least during the worst periods of the contamination from the virus, with high risks to the health of people. In Brazil, at least, it was clear that the streets, they were gained by anti-democratic manifestations. Since people who profess democratic beliefs and practices, they simply refrain from being out there in the streets. This has created a kind of political vacuum, which was immediately fulfilled by crowds deeply attached to authoritarian behaviors and beliefs. So I think that this is only one aspect which is important. The absence of this idea of collectively being together, experiencing politics together, and also the fact that, and this is closely related to this kind of political vacuum that the pandemic has generated, I think that the impossibility of being together to mourn and to mourn the loss of dearest people, I think that this has also pushed an impact on political struggles, because at least in Brazil, during certain times when the peak of contaminations were very high, the streets were emptied except for big crowds getting together with the president and manifesting anti-democratic desires. And that was, it caused a very deeply depressive mood. So people were really really suffering from the impossibility to mourn and to be together and fight collectively. So this is an aspect that I think that most counted during the pandemic. At least in Brazil, this was the case, but I think that elsewhere it was also the case, with the exception perhaps of the Black Lives Matter in the United States at a certain moment in July 2020, which was a huge exception. But here in Brazil, it was complicated.
Thanks, Andre. So before kind of closing, everything that you have told us is so interesting, so important. I kind of just, perhaps you could leave us with, in a nutshell, like some kind of final thoughts about where should we go from here? Is there hope for things to get better? Like what do you think, would be important to do from here? Some final thoughts.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, I think that the most important aspect is for us to redefine the way we would like to live the democratic experience and to reconnect the idea of democratic experience with the power of the demos. Then it is most important for us not to reduce or confound the idea of demos as the abstract sovereign unity, as the notion of the people or the national people. I would like to connect the idea of power of the demos with different and diversified plural struggles which are connected to redistributive politics and also recognition politics. I think that this is a most important aspect to be considered, because otherwise we on the left we will be left with these oppositions between either identity politics or post-identity politics, or no anti-identity politics, or else we will also remain attached to considerations of what democracy is, where we do not pay attention to the importance of identity issues and to the importance of identification issues and ways of connecting people together, because most of people suffering under the crisis of democracy, they come from the margins of society. And many times when we address democracy and the crisis of democracy only on an institutional way or through an institutional framework, we leave aside the consideration of marginalized groups of people who are there and whose struggles really should count. On the other way, if we stick only to the so-called identity politics, then we leave aside the importance of considering democratic features, institutions, etc. So we need to combine these different sets of understandings of democracy. This is what I try to propose in the book, that we overcome this set of hierarchies between different ways of understanding democracy and different political struggles.
Well, thank you very much, André. And we really look forward to reading the English version of the book. And thanks everyone who has watched this interview. And don't forget to check our other videos on the Biopolitics and Democracy website. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Bye-bye.